This is 30XX, a sequel to 20XX. Yeah, I know, it's the kind of hard-hitting, fact-based analysis that you come to this channel for, but really, Battery Staple Games, the creators of 20XX, have decided to, well, go for it again, and in another early access campaign, they are creating 30XX, a sequel to the original set 1,000 years after. And if you've never played the original, what is it? It's basically Megaman X meets Rogue-lite style platformer. So it uses roguelite mechanics, as in like somewhat randomly generated runs, although very chunk-based generation, so that you can make sense of the levels. They aren't completely random, they're made of hand-crafted segments fitted together, which is my personal preferred way to do that sort of level generation, especially in a game that's based on the Mega Man games, where each level had a very specific sort of tile set and set of hazards and things that you had to learn to go around, so that benefits this game definitely. All those roguelite mechanics, including a sort of meta progression, where every time you die you will get some currency that you can spend back at a hub area to improve your chances the next time, and you combine all that with the Mega Man X games, the classic side-scrolling. Well, there isn't really any other thing like Mega Man X, honestly. It's definitely a long-standing series that I very much enjoyed as a kid and still enjoy to this day. I enjoy them actually more than the traditional Mega Man games. I like their themes a little bit more. They are known to be very difficult, very exacting, with lots of platforming challenges and tough bosses to beat, and I'm usually really bad at them despite having played them a lot and very much enjoying them. I seem to sort of hit a ceiling eventually where I just don't get any better at them. I think I'm just not so good at platformers in general, but I still very much enjoy them. And it's always cool to see that formula revived for a different audience, because, well, we haven't really had a Mega Man X game in a while, especially not one in the more side-scroller classic style when they were super, super good. So seeing that concept melded with the roguelite idea that I also happen to really enjoy is always fun, and I definitely enjoyed 20XX despite being very terrible at it, because it was pretty much everything I wanted out of that style of game, and I was obviously very happy to see that they're making a sequel to it. And the sequel seems to be pretty much improved in just about every way. Even though it's in early access currently, and the original game is very good, what they're actually doing, what they're planning, what they've accomplished so far with 30XX is basically just 20XX but more. One of the most noticeable features immediately just upon looking at it is it ditches the sort of puppet animation art style of the original and goes for a more traditional pixel art style, and it is beautiful. The pixel art in this game looks really, really good. The character animations are fantastic. They fit the themes of like a Mega Man X style game. They look and feel like they should, and the actual background detail and overall level detail on each of the tile sets is phenomenal. They look really fantastic. Every level very much has its own themes, its own enemies, its own bosses and mini-bosses, its own hazards and everything, and all of that is very well represented, with each tile set's themes being brought across very well with the very detailed pixel art that's on display. So that is a definite improvement over the original, because, I mean, an art style like this takes a while to create because it's so detailed that they crammed like as much detail as possible into all the little pixel art nooks and crannies of the game, but it shows, and it definitely improves the overall look of the game. It's also very colorful, but not too bright. Something that the Mega Man X games had a very good grasp on was their use of color in a sort of darker tone, so they were still very colorful without being like neon bright, except for the levels which were deliberately meant to be like neon with lasers and stuff everywhere. And this game definitely pulls that sort of aspect of the look off very well as well. So how does it actually play? Well, to start off with, you have to choose a character, and in the current state of the early access, there are two characters to choose from that play entirely differently from each other. First off, you have Nina, who plays basically like X with a chargeable buster that can be spammed for like weak long-range attacks, or charged up for like a piercing, much more high-damage projectile that covers more of the screen. She also gets weapons from every boss kill that reflect something that the boss could do, just like X does. And this is where some of the differences to the Mega Man X games actually come into play, because she doesn't work exactly like X. First off, she has a singular energy resource instead of a sort of separate weapon tank for every individual weapon. This is interesting because it means that you have to be careful about how much energy you're using, since they all use the same resource, but that also means that you don't have to switch between weapons to use them individually and just bind them to different buttons, so you can call any of the weapons you currently have equipped up immediately without having to worry about switching back and forth, which is really nice. The other big difference is that every weapon also acts as a modifier for other weapons. You actually have 3 slots, technically, that you can equip weapons into, but there are also 3 modifier slots, one for each of those, so you have 6 total weapon slots. So every weapon acts both as an actual attack that you can use it for, and it will modify a different weapon if you place it in that slot beneath it instead, completely changing how it works. You can just go to the pause menu at any time to switch around all of your weapons into the different slots and come up with different sort of creative ideas depending on the level that you're currently facing. This is a really cool system. I tend to really enjoy systems that it reminds me of a transistor, actually, where everything is an attack and a modifier to a different attack depending on how you use it. And this allows you to just sort of mix and match and create various combinations of weapons and modifiers. Like if you don't like the traditional mortar that splits into two mortars in the air, you can instead combine it with something else to change it into a mortar that like rains down a whole bunch of little mini cluster projectiles all over the place. Or change your whirlwind attack that usually reaches the whole screen vertically from right where you're standing into a different form of whirlwind attack thingy that will actually sweep across wider areas of the screen but leave a sort of hollow in the middle where you're standing, so you have to use it differently. This is a really cool system, actually, and it means there's a lot of variety to playing this character because she has all sorts of different ways you can mix and match all the various things that you actually have on you at the time to create different abilities, different weapons. And of course, this combines with the fact that you never know which boss you're going to be fighting next, so that you have a different set of weapons than perhaps you did the last run, so you can combine them in different ways each time. And then you also have Ace, who works pretty much like Zero, with a short range, like a melee saber, that can be spammed pretty quickly at close range and can also be charged for a slightly longer range, higher burst damage attack. And instead of getting weapons from bosses, they get techniques, new combo skills that they can carry with them to string together into various combos, and their energy system works differently as well. Whereas Nina has like a large energy gauge, and getting maximum energy power-ups, and it makes the gauge longer. For Ace, instead, you have a smaller energy gauge total, but it regenerates itself on its own. And getting maximum energy instead increases the speed of this regeneration, making you able to string more combos together more quickly. There are all sorts of different techniques you can get, like the big flaming uppercut is one of my favorites, and a lot of them can also be used not just for combat, but also for movement. Like that flaming uppercut, for instance, can be used in midair to extend your jump, as an example. And you also will always start with the ability to throw your current weapon, which depends on the weapon you have equipped, because another aspect of Ace is that you will sometimes come across these statues in missions. They only exist when you're playing as Ace, and if you interact with the statues, they'll spawn usually 3 or 4 waves of enemies, and if you're able to beat the enemies without dying, then you will get a new weapon. And the new weapon will change your basic attacks, your charge attacks, and what that throw button does, depending on what you're equipped with. You can have everything from, say, a spear that gives you a much more precise but longer reaching forward attack. Then you can actually throw the spear to create impromptu platforms, as well as using it as like a longer range attack that you normally lack as Ace, so that's useful. To this sort of crazy mid-range projectile thing that spams really fast projectiles, and if you throw it and doesn't actually throw it, it instead becomes like a sort of a blender in front of you that does tons of really fast close-range slashes. That actually reminds me a lot of the Chrysogrim from Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So all this makes the characters each play very, very drastically differently from each other, requiring a different set of skills to actually utilize. And it means that most of the gameplay variety for Nina is based around creating different combinations of weapons and modifiers to suit the level that you're in, and the gameplay variety from Ace comes in the form of combining the various weapons that you have alongside with the various techniques you have in creating fun combos to actually deal with all the enemies around you. So yeah, they are drastically different from each other, and they both play really well. They both feel like complete fleshed out characters. You'll also find all sorts of different passive skills just lying around, usually as a reward for beating the so-called glory zones or for beating mini-bosses and things. These can be all sorts of different things, from just more basic passives like giving you more health or more energy to more complicated stuff like making power kills have a chance to heal you and some other things like that. And you can also find these things called cores, which only Nina can equip, and they're basically her version of the weapons that Ace gets, that are larger, more overarching changes to their power set and stuff. And this is one difference from 20XX. In the original, when you got a new weapon or a new core, you lost the other one that you were currently holding. You just replaced it. In this game, though, you get to keep all of them. And you can just go to the pause menu at any time and switch around what you actually have equipped because you keep them all. Ace can obviously only have one of the weapons equipped at a time, but you keep all the others in an inventory and can switch between them at will. And Nina has a certain capacity for the various cores, and you can just combine the various ones that you have currently as long as they meet the requirements of how much capacity total you can take up, and you can sort of create your own combination of cores in the pause menu at any time. So I really like that change. It makes you a lot more flexible, and it means that there's no penalty for picking up stuff, although there is a part of the meta progression that allows you to scrap stuff if you don't want to pick it up for some sort of immediate upgrade instead, and you sort of can choose between which one you want. As far as how the meta progression works, it's based around these two currencies, these little cube things and these sort of pyramidal shaped things, and they're called Memoria and Potentia, and you get them from mini boss kills and final boss kills, generally speaking, in different amounts. And every time you die and go back to the hub area, you can spend each of them on different sorts of upgrades. The Memoria is the one that you'll get more often, and it tends to be spent on incremental stat upgrades, like starting with 1 extra health, starting with 1 extra energy, and eventually as you keep upgrading yourself, you'll get a larger amount of stuff that you'll be starting with each time to help you fight better and die less, perhaps. And the Potentia tends to be for larger, more mechanic affecting upgrades, like starting with a new augment right from the beginning, or getting the ability to scrap stuff, just more mechanical unlocks than statistical increases, basically. But one thing that hasn't changed from 20XX is that I'm really bad at it. I'm very, very terrible at this game. I find it really hard, although that's not really a surprise because I also find the Megaman X games very enjoyable but also quite difficult. I will say that although I'm not really comfortable with commenting too much on the difficulty because I'm just not really good enough at it yet to make an informed commentary on whether it's like more or less difficult in certain spots than it should be or whatever, I'm not good enough to decide that yet, but I will say that there are some areas that are noticeably, drastically more difficult than others. The way that it works is you never know exactly what level you're going to go to each time you beat a boss, or indeed where you're going to start. But the overall difficulty of each tile set, of each level, depends on how early it appears. You know, if it appears as the very first one when you first start your run, it'll be a slightly shorter, easier version of that level with less platforming challenge, less platforms in general, less enemies. It'll just be a bit easier. And the farther you go into the run, the harder that particular level that you encounter will be. So every level has multiple different forms that it can take depending on how late in your run it appears. That will determine how difficult it actually is, the sort of iteration that you play on. And I find that there are some levels that are already very difficult, like more difficult than stage 2 or 3 versions of other levels right from the beginning, especially the Penitence area, which is a sort of a cathedral. It's actually my favorite level in terms of its aesthetic, the music, and the bosses. I find it a really interesting level, but it's also really, really hard, even from the very beginning, and if it actually appears at like the 3rd or 4th level in a list, then you're probably screwed. It's really difficult. There are just a couple of levels like that, a couple that the platforming challenges or the enemy challenges or some part of it are just a lot more difficult than other areas at that particular stage in your adventure. This is probably mostly my fault and I just need to actually get used to them, but I do find that there are some areas that I'm not even sure how to get through without taking damage, especially the Crystal Caves area and the Penumbra Cathedral area. They both have some really difficult platforming, and if they appear late enough in a run, I tend to just die because I don't really know how to get through certain areas without taking a whole bunch of damage. But that's not really a criticism though, because I'm still getting used to the game and I definitely need to get better at it before I can adequately say whether or not I think it's actually too difficult in certain areas. But there is one criticism that I do have, and that is the visibility of certain things, especially boss fights. The art style is absolutely beautiful, but sometimes a little bit too busy. They've improved this already and it's made a big difference, but there are still some areas that I find to be a little bit too visually busy, and it makes it easy to, your eyes just kind of glaze over because there's so much glowing stuff on the screen, and you can easily miss like a hidden mole or something that you couldn't see before because everything is so just in your face. There are a couple of areas in the game that suffer from this a little bit worse, where the visibility of the hazards and the enemies is a little bit less than I would like, but of particular note to me are a couple of boss fights that almost seem to break their own rules, because the way that they change in the second phase, it makes it kind of unclear what you're actually supposed to do. There is one boss fight in particular that will cover itself in a crystal shield and dash around the arena, and when this first happened, I figured that I was supposed to just outlast the boss. You know, this is going to be some sort of invulnerability attack endurance phase where I just had to make sure to dodge the attacks, live, and then eventually the shield will come down and I can fight the boss again. But no, you're actually supposed to just walk into the shield and hit the boss in point blank range. There is no indication that this is what you're supposed to do, because at every other point during this boss fight, all that crystal energy stuff that the boss does hurts you when you touch it, and there's no indication that this one thing is going to be any different and that you should actually touch it. It's a bit weird that it makes you do that, but I think that there could be maybe a little bit more. It could be a little bit more obvious that you're supposed to fight the boss this way and it's not going to hurt you by walking into the shield. There's another boss that halfway through its boss fight will just sort of phase out of existence, and the background of the arena will glow a little bit and start firing a bunch of projectiles at you. This is another instance that I thought was going to be like a gauntlet survival thing where you just had to outlast the attacks and then the boss would reappear again. But it turns out you're actually supposed to hit the background of the level, which makes no sense, because that thing has been in the background of this entire boss fight and you've been able to fire through it and can walk through it without any problems up until this point. There's no indication that suddenly it's something that actually takes damage, even though that it's still in the background. So I found that this particular aspect of that boss fight didn't really make a lot of sense to me, because suddenly something that has been in the background this entire fight that you couldn't ever interact with can hurt you, and you can shoot it, and there's not really an indication that that's the case. I think that there are just a couple of boss fights where some of the phase changes could be a little bit more obvious what you're actually supposed to do, and that not very many of them are actually endurance rounds, and you're actually supposed to, you can still hit the boss in some way, it's just not entirely clear that you're supposed to do so. That being said, though, I do find the boss fights to be a high point of the game. They are all really well designed, even if I have some frustrations with some of them. Most of that is probably just because I suck at the game. And the boss fights are visually really interesting. They have fantastic soundtracks, and there are a lot of really fun attacks in multiple phases and things that make them really enjoyable to fight, as well as the mini-bosses. The mini-bosses are actually very memorable. They are not just throwaway enemies, and they range from everything from like a giant neon snake, like in the old Snake game, and if you're able to make it snake around and hit its own body, it will just die instantly, which is funny, to a boss fight that works more like Ikaruga, sort of, where you have to angle these mirrors around the place and actually attack the bosses with their own projectiles of the right color to do extra damage to them. So yeah, the mini-boss fights and boss fights in this game are actually really, really good. They're very well designed and they're very enjoyable. And overall, it's just a really fantastic game. I'm excited to see where it goes, because what's currently in the game already feels quite finished. It feels well fleshed out, so whatever they're going to add next is going to be pretty interesting. And this is, I feel, in early access that can definitely be trusted to deliver, because they've done it before. You know, they did the same thing with 20XX, which ended up as a fantastic game, and it looks like they're just doing the exact same thing here, only even better. So that is 30XX. If you want to check it out, the link, as always, will be in the description below this video. That'll take you to the Steam Early Access page. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.